This is IAQ Radio, Indoor Air Quality Radio, the voice of the indoor air quality industry, with your hosts, Radio Joe Hughes and the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick. And now, Radio Joe Hughes.
Good day and welcome to IAQ Radio Plus. It's episode 710, and this week we welcome Tom Laubenthal of TGL Consulting. We're going to talk about asbestos and lead, past, present, and future. Before we get started, let's thank our sponsors. They're the reason we can continue doing the show. And don't forget, after the show, we've got afterthoughts.iaqradio.com, sponsored by First On Site. IAQ Radio Plus marquee sponsor is First On Site Property Restoration at firstonsite.com. IAQ Radio Association sponsors are ACGIH, the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists at acgih.org. AIHA, the American Industrial Hygiene Association at aiha.org. IICRC, the Institute for Inspection, Cleaning, and Restoration Certification at iicrc.org. The Restoration Industry Association, RIA, at restorationindustry.org. The Environmental Information Association, EIA, at eia-usa.org. IAQ Radio industry sponsors are Particles Plus at particlesplus.com, TSI Inc. at tsi.com, Tramex Meters at tramexmeters.com, and Healthy Indoors Magazine at healthyindoors.com.
And now you can win a cool prize. It's time for the IAQ Radio Trivia question. Be the first to correctly answer. Simply email your answer to czlotnick at cs.com. Or if listening live, just text your answer from your computer. And now, here's the Z-Man.
Hello, everyone. Congratulations go out to Robert Spielvogel, Brookline, Massachusetts, who was first to identify molasses as the edible substance that spilled and was responsible for killing 21 people and injuring 150 more in Boston, Massachusetts 104 years ago, and for devastating marine life in Honolulu, Hawaii in 2013. Here's today's IAQ Radio Trivia question. What is the common thread shared by these celebrities? Steve McQueen, Ed Lauder, Merlin Olsen, and Paul Gleason. Back to you, Joe.
All right. Today we've got Tom Laubenthal. He's the owner of TGL Consulting based in Fort Lauderdale. He's I'm going on 40 years now of industry service, considered an internationally recognized subject matter within the asbestos and lead paint control industries. He served in a variety of leadership roles, including as a past national president of the Environmental Information Association, one of our sponsors. He currently serves as on the national board of the Lead and Environmental Hazards Association, and he manages the Asbestos Professional Network page on LinkedIn, and they've got about 17,000 members. Welcome, Tom. Great to see you.
Great to be here, guys. Very happy to be here.
You know, Tom, I think a lot of our audience may know you better as the guy that did training for many years. Can you tell us a little bit about your background in the training world?
Sure. Actually, in the long run, when I started in the industry, I worked with a group called Macron. We were a microscopy company. We also did field work, but I got recruited into what we had years ago called the National Asbestos Council, which became the EIA down the road. And I was very lucky to land their training director position back in around 1987, 88 timeframe. And I did that work for a while, then went off on my own and worked with a group called the Environmental Institute, which was part of ATC Group Services for many years. And I served on their staff for 18 years and kind of helped redevelop the training industry as we knew it, from leaving the 35 millimeter slides and overheads into the PowerPoint world, and really trying to upgrade what people are actually learning instead of just looking at a few words on an overhead. And we kind of helped move the industry a little bit forward. We had a very loyal group there for years. The ATC finally did sell out to a bigger group, and the bigger group sold off the Environmental Institute. So I thought it was time for me to move into private consulting.
Interesting. What's the landscape like right now for asbestos and lead training? It was a tough. I mean, for a long time, it was a nice area to do training in. You could make a good buck at it. Then it seemed like things got really tough. How are things today?
Well, it has everything to do with population centers. The Institute, we were very lucky to be in Atlanta. So we were centralized to the Southeast. So we had people coming to us from all over the Southeast. Our refresher classes, we'd have 25 people easily every class. Initial classes, 20, 25 people. So we stayed very busy, and they still are very busy because of their location. When you might have a lot of competition, it drags away from the training that other people may have as the industry's got a little bit smaller with commoditization and companies buying things out over the years. But there are still people out there doing this. It's just not big operations much anymore. A lot of times you'll find very capable training organizations that may just have a person or two running it instead of an entire staff. So it has changed over the years. I would say it's not the heady days of when we were working with schools. I can assure you that.
Yeah, those were heady days. All right. There were some things that went on then that I thought were a little greedy from some people, but we can talk about that as the show goes on. Now, when we talked earlier in the week, you had showed me a slide that was called "What We Are Not Doing" slide that you were you needed to develop so that when people came into your courses, they could better understand what you were doing and what you were not doing. Can you tell us a little bit about that slide?
Well, actually, it had to do with the renovator class that we were teaching for the lead-based paint industry. And a lot of these guys really weren't thrilled about having to take this class and be involved with upgrading their services to actually deal with lead debris, waste, cleaning, that sort of thing when they did renovation work. And these guys, I think many of them thought that as a training entity, we were nothing more than an extension of, say, the EPA. So they wanted to come to class and kind of argue this stuff out. Why do we need to do all of this? And how do I price all this? So we finally had to start telling the classes, folks, we're just a training provider. We're not here to make up these rules. We're only here to teach it to them. And so with certain groups of people, that became necessity because they didn't really want to have to be there. But I think a lot of times these people that come to classes think that we're all agency extensions, which we're not. We're capitalists like everybody else.
That lead RRP rule was a thing that helped a lot of the training providers because you got a lot of people in, people were able to keep the doors open, making pretty good money and getting a lot of people in. How's that going today? Is it still a busy thing? Do you know?
It has everything to do with the state that you're in. There's only a handful of states that actually have state designated programs where they actually run it on behalf of the EPA. If you have a state that's a designated program, there's enforcement and people knock on doors and people realize they have to come to class. But when you get into areas where it's not state designated or there aren't training providers available, which is a really big problem for this one, guys aren't getting trained and it isn't happening that way. So it has a lot to do with having a state designated program. And the EPA, people think there's EPA people out driving the cars around in the streets. That's crazy. We haven't had that in years. Frankly, you wanted smaller government. This is what you got. And they don't have the people to necessarily do all of this, although they will do record search as they've done this on bigger entities. And with the RRP program, it's not just the work, it's paperwork that you have to keep as well. And that's where these contractors get pounded if they do get hit by EPA. Is typically not the work in the field, it's their records.
Now, early on, and I don't know if this is still going on or not, but there was some enforcement. I think it mainly focused on the big players. Can you tell our audience a little bit more about that?
Well, sure, because what's happened is that in the initial industry of what we call renovation, repair, and painting, or what we call RRP, it's an EPA program. The thing is, I don't think a lot of people, until you work with these groups, you don't realize how big they are. We're talking about the Lowe's, the Home Depots, the Sears, these larger entities that do this work. They have thousands of installers and do thousands of projects every day. So the EPA did look at these big entities pretty closely, and not just them. There were others as well. And what happens is they didn't have paperwork, or the guys weren't getting trained, and they got hammered pretty hard. And I was involved with working with Home Depot. I've helped out Lowe's as well in terms of helping them understand at that time what they needed to do. But I can assure you these days, for their subcontractors, if they're working in pre-1978 houses where these rules apply, if they don't come up with the paperwork, they don't get paid. So the tune has changed in that larger entity sector.
Interesting. There's a current event going on right now, and I want to kind of back into it a little bit by talking a little bit about clearance. With the RRP, clearance of a project was done by the contractor himself, if I recall correctly, and they would use a wipe, and they would wipe 1 square foot area, maybe, Tom?
Yeah, well, it's effectively that. It's what we call cleaning verification, and what they get when they come to class is a card that has two different colored wipes. One is clean, and one has just a bit of dust on it. It's like a light brown color, and as long as they're lighter than that color, then they pass. It's a visual process, quite frankly. Whereas with lead abatement, it's clearance. We actually take a wipe of different surfaces. It goes to a chemistry laboratory, and there are very strict numbers by which they have to meet to actually pass. It's very different than our RP.
And what are the current numbers?
For clearance, it's less than 10 on a floor, 40 on a windowsill, and 100 in a window trough, I believe.
And that has already come down from early on. I recall,
God, yeah.
100 on the floor?
No, it's 400 at one point.
400.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's what, micrograms per deciliter? Is that
micrograms per square foot.
Per square foot, I'm sorry.
So,
okay.
yeah, right now we're basically at 10 and 100 on the floors and windowsills for EPA. And what they want to do is they want to drop this even lower, and from 10 on the floor to 3 micrograms per square foot on the floor, 25 micrograms on windowsills, and 20 micrograms per square foot on windowsills, and 25 micrograms in what we call the window troughs, which sits behind the sill.
And that has been pretty controversial, as I understand it. They want to drop it, understandably, because, they're saying there's no safe level for children in particular for lead, but it was tough enough to get down to the 10 or even the 100, if I recall correctly, back in the day. Can you kind of give us an idea of what the industry, the people who are going to have to meet this new criteria, are saying about the proposal?
Oh, sure. In the long run, there's a lot of controversy, and there's a number of reasons of controversy. It's not just the ability of a contractor to meet those small numbers. It's also the ability of the chemistry laboratories performing the analysis on these wipes to be able to actually report down to that low level. That's an entirely longer conversation, but if you look at the webpage where they're putting up public comments, you're going to find the bigger lab entities are making this very clear. And the technique we use is called flame atomic absorption, or AA. And they may have to go to more advanced techniques, which is going to really drive the price up of analytical work. But for the contractors themselves, they want to know is if we go from, say, less to 10 and then down to 3, does that really improve the situation in terms of less poisoned children? Well, in the long run, I will tell you, through history, as these clearance and risk levels have gone lower, we have had less lead poisoned children. But we're now at the point where people are asking, are we really gaining a benefit from this? And then on top of it, can we actually get that number? Because if you hit a 3.1, you're done. You got to go back and re-clean. And we're talking about adding $1,500 to $2,500 to a job should we encounter these problems, as well as the additional cleaning.
And on the floor, if I recall correctly, it's been a while, so correct me if I'm wrong, you would remove the lead, whatever lead contamination or paint. So there might just be dust there. There might be some paint there. You may have to remove some paint. And then you would clean it up real well, and you were allowed to seal the floor before they did the testing. Was that accurate?
Well, actually, that comes out of a document we call the HUD Guidelines, which is a very large document that the Department of Housing and Urban Development puts out. That is our standard working practices of how we go about doing our work. And yes, they are allowed, after we get visual inspection, to do sealing of floors, like with wax, put down floor tiles. If they have stripped wood, like around windows, they can repaint. The one problem we have with it in the industry, and it isn't allowed in a lot of places, because in the HUD guidelines, they leave it up to the supervisor to make that visual inspection. What we'd like to see is the inspector risk assessors have to do the visual inspection before clearance. Let them do the visual inspection first, and then let them seal. Because if they could seal the floors after a good formal visual inspection by a certified individual, that was certainly going to help the industry meet this 3 standard, I would think.
Interesting. All right. Now, a large part of our audience, let me also do this. How does the blood lead level compare to clearance level? Is there, we're dropping that clearance level from 400 to 100 to 10 to 3. How is there a comparison between the blood lead level in the occupants, usually children we're worried about, and that clearance level?
Well, like I said, what happens is as we've lowered them over the years, we have seen less lead poisoned children per capita, and it varies in states and things of that nature. But there has been a direct correlation between tightening the rules and less poisoned children. But the issue is, even if, say, we do a couple of rooms in a house, okay, we take it, say, down to 3, or we do risk assessment above a theoretical 0 per se. That doesn't mean every lead hazard is cleaned up around the house. Has the soil been treated outside? If we have lead-based paint on the outside, the kids are still playing in the dirt or dragging it in the house. So the concept is we're not removing all sources. We're not dealing with all of it. We may be only required by HUD grants to maybe work in a couple rooms because of deteriorated paint. Well, we can improve those rooms, but have we increased the whole area? So kids that are around lead, there's always a couple of micrograms per deciliter in their body. It's just part of the environment. So to get it down to a 0, I'm not sure that's going to happen because of the amount that we have in the environment at this time.
Now, a big part of our audience are restoration contractors, water damage, fire, etc.
Sure.
And they run into these issues all the time, and they have, their own problems about getting insurance companies to pay for asbestos inspections and lead inspections, and
all the time.
It's a tough time for these guys. As the restoration audience, number one, it seems to me they would be a good source of work for lead inspectors and people who do lead and asbestos inspectors and people who do remediation. Do they see it that way?
Some do. The thing is, most of these big environmental companies, they're looking at the bigger prize. They're looking at working for the big Fortune 500 corporations. They don't always look downward in terms of where they could find other revenue sources. Some do, but what we tend to see is big companies with big companies, small companies with small companies. I have a friend that's in the Atlanta area that does lead-based paint inspections, that's been doing work for RP contractors for some time now, doing testing. One other thing I want to throw in here that you may not be aware of, with the renovation, repair, and painting program, we have to test the surfaces to determine if they have lead. And 3M puts out a product called lead check swabs. They look like little crayons that have chemicals in them. Yes. You rub it on you scrape down the paint down to the base, and you rub it in there, and it turns red if we have lead. It's not a perfect system, but it works. 3M, they're just not available. 3M just isn't making them available right now. So what's happened is with a lot of contractors is that because they don't have the availability of that, or another product we call D-lead, which was much more difficult to use, in my opinion, they're just saying lead. And we're dropping $1,500, $2,500 extra on an RP class because they don't have the lead check swabs. So I think in the long run, what we need to do is need to get these inspectors to understand, if the companies see it as viable revenue, to come up with a deal price to get out and do some work for these RP contractors with those XRFs to do testing like we do for lead inspections. So I think there is a market opportunity that they would be working with. Now, I've worked with a lot of restoration contractors trying to work with their, what do you call it? Not underwriters, the insurance adjusters, the adjusters. And what I've done is I've put together fact sheets for these restoration companies that basically explains to these people, we have to do asbestos, we have to do lead. It has all the regulations on it. I've done online training for their staff to get them to understand how to explain it to these people. But most of these insurance people, remember, their job is to not pay you. So the bottom line is, the more we can enable our restoration contractor community to communicate with these issues better, the better chance they're going to get of being able to do the work properly and get paid for it.
I think it would be nice to link to those documents in Cliff's blog if they're freely available for restoration people, because like I said, we've got a big audience. Let me let Cliff jump in here because I know he had a couple questions along these lines.
Well, I guess the first one was, by XRF, you mean X-ray fluorescence, correct?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So But that's an expensive device. I mean, you're looking at the price of the car, for
Well,
those.
yeah, they're 12, 13, 14, up to $20,000 a piece or more.
Correct.
So it isn't the kind of thing an RP contractor is going to buy. The lead inspectors, the only people that buy them are the ones that can keep them busy to pay for it.
Plus, they have to recalibrate it or have it checked every so often. Or
well, the radioactive source in these things does not last forever. It lasts for a few years, and they have to be replaced, and that's thousands of dollars as well. So that's why I'm saying it's not the kind of device you buy to use occasionally. So that's why the lead inspectors that actually take the time to buy these devices do their best to stay busy with it, just to pay for the device, if nothing else.
And then what do they do? I actually have a couple of them, actually, because my wife's in the jewelry business, and we use them to determine what type of metal
assay.
Yeah, that we have. But so do they print it out? Do they just take a photograph of it?
No, when they do the testing inside the machines themselves, and if people haven't seen them, I'm sorry, I don't have a picture ready to put up. Imagine like a small plastic handgun.
Right.
And what you have is a very small radioactive source. And when they press it up against the surface, it's like a camera iris. It just opens and closes very quickly, shoots energy out, information comes back, and there's a little LED screen on these things that pops up what the value is. And if we hit 1.0 milligram per centimeter squared, we have regulated lead-based paint. And so what they'll do is they'll keep track of the shots that they do. That's what we call them, shots, when you're actually working on the walls or surfaces of any type. And they'll either keep it in the electronic part, or they'll actually have forms that they kind of fill out as they go.
As they go.
And then formal reports get written, which are required by HUD, and there are standard report formats that are given to these people when they take classes. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. I guess, a lot of, we never know when where disasters, going to occur. And there's urban areas like you were talking about, Atlanta. And as a matter of fact, one of your former students sent me a private message about how great you were in the course and so on and so forth. So your fans are out there. But what about in these rural areas? How are you going to bring someone in order to, test for asbestos or, test for lead? So I guess the question is, do you need to have a government certification in order to do this? Or do you have to bring in a third party to do it? Or is there a way that a restoration contractor and his employees can be trained to do their own testing?
Actually, I would have to say in the last 10 years that I was with the Environmental Institute, we saw more and more and more restoration contractors send young people through to become asbestos inspectors, so they had that in their toolbox. So that way they can take these samples as they go. Now with lead, if you're in a structure that's pre-78, it's always best to assume lead unless you can test it. But again, the mantra when it comes to lead, the older the place, the more likely. So pre-1940, you can just about take to the bank you're going to have lead. It's about 2/3 in between 40 and 60, and it gets smaller as you go toward 1978. So the older the joint, more likely. So the thing is, in the long run, if we have to encounter these materials, I think it's best to make assumptions unless we have people that are there, or your adjusters are going to allow you to bring people in, because these people should know this. But that's why those fact sheets that I produce for people are helpful.
And let's kind of go down let's kind of summarize what they can and cannot do. For asbestos, there's a federal regulation. You have to have you have to be trained as an asbestos inspector.
And then the states might go ahead. The states might require licensing. Go ahead.
Okay. How many states currently require licensing, if you know off the top of your head?
I actually don't, Guy, but it's probably a majority.
Okay. So for asbestos, now, can a restoration contractor test their own project for asbestos? If they have the licensing and they got the training, can they test their own project?
The thing is, I have to kind of explain a little bit of history on this.
Go ahead.
What happens is, in the long run, if it's a reputable firm, I don't have a problem with it personally, but there are a lot of people that do, because they want the inspections to stay with the inspection firms. Okay. But the fact remains is if we have competent companies out there that are going to do this right, that's fine. But we've got case history with OSHA and EPA of contractors that do shoddy inspections where they will not take samples of asbestos. So they don't find any. They take like fiberglass samples, or they take whatever to make it look like they did something. Or we've even had cases where they had their hands in the pockets of laboratories and things became asbestos when they worked. So, I mean, there's a lot of case history of fraud with sampling. So this is why a lot of the states have kind of clamped down on this, is that they want it with the certified firms that do that kind of work, that have certified people, I should say, licensed if it were for the state, at least trained to do this kind of work so that we could avoid the fraud. I actually don't have a problem with a restoration contractor out in the middle of nowhere on the coast someplace, and you have to do testing and you have a trained inspector. Yeah, I would rather you take the samples than have to hassle with bringing somebody in if you're truly in a remote location. But it does depend on the state and the regulations and how they have it written.
And the course teaches you that you need to take a certain number of samples in the location and how to determine whether that, let's say, thermal system insulation goes through the whole building, and you can take 3 samples for the whole building, or if you have to go to different areas of the building, you learn all that in the course.
Well, actually, in the long run, these courses that we teach in asbestos are all based on a school's rule that we refer to as AHERA, AHERA, which is an acronym for the statute. Okay. And it's asbestos-containing materials in schools, and it's schools K through 12. So when you do an inspection in a school, it's very formula how we take samples. You have to take so many samples of this. You have to take so many samples of that, which is what you're describing. Now, in the world of that you live in, this is not unless it's in disaster recovery. Now you're in a different EPA regulation we call NESHAP, NESHAP, the asbestos NESHAP regulation. And in that regulation, basically, it's your job to find all the friable and non-friable. And for those that are new to this, friable are materials that we can easily crush with hand pressure. A non-friable would be like a floor tile that you can't crush with hand pressure. But you have to find every type that's there. So there isn't a specific number that you have to take. You just have to make sure you take enough samples to know what you have on site.
Okay. Let's go to the lead side now. So we're talking about the asbestos side. They have to at least have a certification from EPA, maybe a state license. And there is no allowance for, let's say, like the lead RRP, where you're only going to disturb a certain amount of material. Well, I guess with NESHAP, it's less than 160 and 260. But you still have to take the samples, right?
Which one, for lead?
For NESHAP, I'm just, even
well,
if
the point is you have to figure out what you have. I mean, do you have 160 square feet of what we call surfacing material, which is like textured ceilings or fireproofing, or 260 linear feet of pipe insulation, as an example? That's when NESHAP kicks in terms of regulating. It's also when you have to notify for removal. But here's the deal with all demolitions have to be notified. So if you're going to demolish the facility, you do have to do a notification, and the survey would have to occur. And we have to make sure we understand what's there. Everything from roofing materials down to flooring materials. There's a gamut of things. I sent you a list that I could put up on the screen here. There's far more materials that can be in buildings than people realize.
Yeah. Now, one of the things I see commonly is recommendation that because you're a restoration contractor, you're not certified or licensed to take asbestos samples, that sometimes they'll recommend you have the homeowner do that because there are no regulations on them in a residential property. Does that make sense to you, Tom?
Nah, because I think that I would hazard to guess that most of you guys that are doing restoration work have respirator trained people at the very least, working with mold and things of that nature. To send in a homeowner with an N95, which is the simple dust mask, folks, that like we've seen with COVID and things like that, and to take asbestos samples, that's never really recommended. Now, can they? Yes, they can, because as homeowners aren't regulated in their own homes, we always have to remember that when it comes to OSHA regulations on these types of things, they regulate commerce, not private domiciles. So I wouldn't recommend it, but maybe people do. I'll be honest with you, taking an asbestos inspector class is not that expensive. And I would highly recommend that restoration contractors get a person or two trained up to be able to do that work when they encounter those types of buildings.
And the sample analysis is really inexpensive today too, isn't it? What are
Sure,
you talking, 10, 15?
$15 a sample, something like that. The only other problem with that is if you're in a very remote location, this is the fallacy that a lot of people have. They think there's an asbestos laboratory in every city. No, not at all. They tend to be in larger population centers, not all, but some of them. So in the long run, probably the biggest hassle is getting samples off to a lab. They can get them turned around pretty quickly, but it may take you a day or two to figure that out with shipping samples to a laboratory.
All right, I'd like to go through the same thing with lead and lead sampling, but first we've got to stop and thank our sponsors. We're at halftime point, John. Our marquee sponsor is First On Site, your trusted full-service disaster recovery and property restoration company at firstonsite.com. Association sponsors are ACGIH, Advancing Careers of Professionals in Environmental Health, Industrial Hygiene, and Safety, interested in defining their science. ACGIH.org. AIHA, Healthy Workplaces, A Healthier World. AIHA.org. The Environmental Information Association, EIA's multidisciplinary membership collects, generates, and disseminates information concerning environmental and occupational health hazards in the built environment at EIA-USA.org. The IICRC, a nonprofit standards development and certifying body for the cleaning and restoration industry, IICRC.org. The Restoration Industry Association, the oldest and largest nonprofit professional trade association dedicated to providing leadership and promoting best practices through advocacy, standards, and professional qualifications for the restoration industry at restorationindustry.org. Industry sponsors are Particles Plus, feature-rich particle counters and air quality instrumentation. Count on us, particlesplus.com. TSI Inc., an industry leader in precision instrumentation for monitoring indoor air. Learn how to expand your IAQ investigations, TSI.com. Tramex Meters, developing modern dynamic moisture meters and humidity monitoring systems since 1974. TramexMeters.com. And Healthy Indoors Magazine, a free online magazine for industry professionals and consumers, healthyindoors.com. All right, we're back with Tom Laubenthal. We're going to talk a little more asbestos and lead here, but Cliff, I want to turn it over to you for a follow-up.
Yeah, Tom, but we've got a wide range of listeners and many people download it afterwards. If you could be kind enough to walk the audience through how these various asbestos samples of materials are taken, can you just kind of describe the method that's used in order to take the sample, maybe
Sure.
Of a sealing substance or suspected substances?
Frankly, every material is a little bit different, and as you could imagine, it's a challenge in a classroom trying to talk about everything you could possibly sample. But the thing is, what we need to do first and foremost, respiratory protection, P100 respirator cartridges, which are the purple cartridges. What we want to do is have a spray bottle that you can wet the material with. What I would do is just get, one of the standard spray bottles and maybe put just a couple of drips of Dawn detergent in there to break the surface tension. You want to wet the surface just enough so that we don't get dust when we sample. You could take a small paint scraper, and what I would suggest is you got to have sample containers ready to go. And what a lot of people are using today, the little kids snack bags, they're shorty bags.
Yeah.
Okay. Not the ones with the plastic sliders. Do not use those. Use the ones with just a finger close. Okay. The plastic slider ones, we don't know whether people don't close them or they open in transit. The labs hate them. But just the kids' snack bags. And what you could do, like say you got a textured ceiling, what I do is I take half a piece of paper and I put it up underneath it. And what we do is we scrape the surface and imagine something about that big, maybe 1.5 inches, 2 inches on a side. You get into that piece of paper, have your plastic bag ready, you fold the paper in half and just slide it into the plastic bag. Then you throw that paper away as asbestos waste. So have a bag set up for that. Close your bag, make sure that you kind of Have that thing completely zip closed, wipe the bag down. The labs don't want to see debris on the outside of the bag, so have some wet wipes with you and wet wipe your tools and clean your hands after every sample. Okay. Pipe installation is a little bit different. What we need to do with pipe installation, you could use an 1.5-inch chisel. And what we can do is we can press into the material and kind of withdraw again into a piece of paper and then wet it a couple of times as you're going into it. So we don't want to see poof when you're sampling. And then we can transfer that into a sample container. Okay. Flooring materials, if you already have broken floor tiles, just think a couple, 1.5, 2 inches on the side. You could just pick a piece off the ground and throw it in a plastic bag if it's already been damaged. The best thing to do with the flooring materials, though, is if there is no mastic, the adhesive, like it's often black, but it could be different colors. You want to make sure it's either on the back or sample it separately, because sometimes the floor tiles would be negative, but the mastic off it is. Okay. And that's the stuff that seals it down. And it gets complicated. There's a lot of different kind of materials, but in homes, you're going to find typically flooring materials, wallboard joint compound. The idea is with the joint compound, if you could find where the seam is, take a chisel and sample directly into the seam, get a chunk of that drywall, get it into a sample container. Don't sample it with the wallboard. Wallboards, I mean, we're talking holy grail rare to have asbestos in the wallboard. It's going to be in the joint compound. Okay. I have 2 samples with asbestos in the wallboard, and they're both from the West Coast. I just don't think it was ever really widespread. It was out there for a couple of years, many years ago. So it's really the joint compound. We have that in the basements. We can have the old forced air systems. It has the paper wrapping on ductwork. That's not uncommon. What you guys face in restoration often is multiple layers of flooring. You could have a couple layers of linoleum over the top of a couple layers of floor tiles. You got to try to sample those as best you can, each of them if you can. Sometimes when there's fires have occurred, those things are annealed together, and you might actually have to get an axe and a hammer and kind of bang it down to break off a piece of all of that. It's ideal to have them separate, but I've talked to restoration contractors where after a fire, everything is kind of annealed together. Sometimes that's all you can do. Laboratory then has to pry all that stuff apart and figure out what you got, and do expect to pay a little bit more for that. We can have roofing materials. It would be utterly rare for shingles to have asbestos in it these days, unless it's a very old house or lots of layers that shouldn't be there. But the flashings and cements can be. And again, bathrooms, kitchens, wallboard joint compounds. We can also have the outside of the houses that what we call transite, which is an asbestos cement that are like shingles on the outside of a house. The best thing with that is a pair of vice grips. Just grab a corner and just kind of bust off a corner. It'll come off real easy. But there's not much way you can wet it, but that's why the respirator is really necessary. Just get us, again, something the size of $50 would be good enough for that. Generally, it's not difficult to analyze, but those are the common things. So it's basically a set of hand tools and learning how to use the hand tools to pry, cut, and break what you need. The big issue with laboratories is don't send stuff that's too small. That's what I'm saying. I'm holding my hands up like this. They need something to work with. Okay.
Gotcha. Tom, let's talk about lead for just a moment and the difference between RRP sampling and other types of sampling. Can you kind of go through that real quick for our audience, especially with the bent toward the restoration side of things?
Actually, what you asked a question before, and can I share a screen real quick?
Sure.
So the whole point is, Guy, without taking the time to go through all of this, I'll make sure that you guys have a link that you can put in your blog and send to your other people. But it's detailed, and all kinds. See these questions and answers. There's a Q&A document for RRP and for lead. It's on the EPA webpage. And what these are is all kinds of questions and answers about emergency renovations and natural disasters. See the natural disasters? So what I would tell you to do, so we don't have to take our time to go through all of this stuff, is I will send this to you so your people could look at it and see what it tells them exactly. This is the policy of the EPA currently. Does that help?
Yep.
That's a great way to go right there, Tom. I like that. Now, when it comes to asbestos, we've been removing asbestos since probably the mid 80s now. And a lot of that work focused on, thermal system insulation, pipe insulation, boiler insulation, et cetera. Surfacing materials like fireproofing and spray applied acoustical plasters, et cetera. And I was kind of under the impression a lot of that, like low-hanging fruit, I call it, was gone. But you kind of, I don't know that you agree.
No, not even close. Maybe later we'll talk about a document we revised for the EPA called the Purple Book some years back. When we did that, we polled a lot of people to get an idea of what they thought removal had occurred that were been around the industry for years. Now, the emphasis was on schools, and there were some schools that removed just because they could get the funding for it. There are sometimes in schools we had to do removal because we had significantly damaged materials. So a lot of that activity was in schools. Also in the industrial and commercial perspective, some of that work was done as well. But if people haven't worked in the industrial sector, paper mills, power plants, refineries, there are millions of miles of insulated pipe that are still out there that are being managed every day by these people. We have no earthly idea how much fireproofing is still in buildings. Now, that was banned in 1973, but the fact is there are still a lot of those buildings around, folks. So we have no earthly idea how much of that is there. This work will continue for multiple generations, friend. The estimates that I got from my friends is maybe we've removed 25% of what's in the schools. And outside of schools, it's a few percent, 3 to 4, 5% at best. So most of what was installed is still in place.
I want to make sure we focus for a moment on that Purple Book you mentioned. I think a lot of our audience doesn't know what that is or how it was developed and how it was recently revised. Can you go over that with our audience?
Sure. Is that up?
There it is. Yep.
Okay, guys. What happens is in the late 70s and into the early 90s, the EPA put out a bunch of guidance documents that by nature had a color to them. Okay, so they had titles, they had numbers, but we went by the colors. There was a green book, silver book, black book, orange books, pink book. But the one that came out in 1985, we called the Purple Book. And what you're seeing on the screen is the revised version. The original Purple Book, when I was a kid in this industry, I started in 1984. Purple Book came out in 85. It was our Bible. It was everything that we knew about asbestos, OSHA, EPA. But here's the thing. Every regulation changed since that was written. Now, there's still good advice in that document in terms of work practices and things, but all the regulations changed. And the EPA people were still recommending that book, and it was like, no. Asbestos NESHAP changed in 90. OSHA, all their regulations changed for asbestos, but 94, 95 timeframe. So EPA came to the EIA at one point, and it basically said in so many words, you think we need to update this in like a 10-year-old, you think? And what happened is we decided to put a committee together to look into working with them on that. And we came up with a bunch of ideas for how to proceed with that. And what we did is we put together a group of writers. We had an oversight group that was working with us, and then eventually peer reviewers. And we wrote this whole thing. Initially, we thought that might be a web page, and it didn't turn out to be a web page. EPA didn't have the funding to do that. So the EIA decided we would do this as an internal publication. So what we had to do is take the document and kind of rewrite it again into a paragraphical form instead of a content for a web page form. And what you see in front of you is one of the only books that you're going to find that is modern, that is going to cover everything that we know about asbestos today. Now, what this document is not a guidance document for the contractors in terms of here's how you do removal. If you notice the title, this is Managing Asbestos in Buildings, a Guide for Owners and Managers. So it was written specifically for people that are managing this stuff in buildings, and it gives them all the examples of what is asbestos, some of the most modern information about health effects, how to do inspections, what types of things are done in inspections, what we call management plan issues and risk type issues. Then we also have a whole section on removal options, the different kinds of things that we can do that are part of what we call response actions, encapsulation, closure, removal, although we tend to do removal more than anything today. So it's a good comprehensive document. If somebody wanted to get one document to kind of read what this industry is about, this is where you would go.
And that was kind of rare that a group like the Environmental Information Association would rewrite or update an EPA document. Is that accurate to say, Tom?
Oh, sure. And usually what happens is when EPA does this, they have these gigantic vendors that they work with that do these kind of things. Well, they came to us and we kind of had an agreement that we would work on it for them. And because the work that was done initially we were hoping they would pick it up and run with it. Their funding was cut. So we just decided, because we had put all this work into it, we may as well just self-publish it through the organization. And we did. And as I understand it, for Brent Kynock, we've sold thousands of copies of this thing at this point.
That's a great story. Great story. I've got a question on one of the things that I always wondered about. I don't know that I ever got a real good answer. I'm hoping you can give me one. Is when we're doing building demolition, we have to remove all the asbestos containing materials, including things like, well, you let me know if that's still the case, but
okay,
floor tile, the mastic, maybe some adhesives, maybe some caulking in windows, etc. What is that based on? Is there good evidence to show that demolishing a building in place with those materials in place is going to cause an exposure issue for the people doing the work? Or is it maybe that those materials will leach into landfills? I never quite understood why that was required.
Okay, so what happens is there's a perspective that we have to remove all asbestos, and in some states we actually have to, just the way the state rules are written. But the issue is, with this rule we call the asbestos NESHAP, N-E-S-H-A-P, NESHAP, basically has three categories of material. RACM, regulated asbestos containing materials. Those are the materials that need to be removed, and those are materials that are already friable, like pipe insulation, fireproofing, and the like. And those non-friable categories that could become friable or are in poor condition. Okay, and there's a definition for poor condition, means it's broken, crumbled, a number of different terms that they use there. So what happens is that the thought was, when NESHAP was published back in 1990, that category 1 materials, which are primarily roofing and flooring materials, there's also packings and gaskets, which we rarely have to deal with outside of maintenance, that could stay in a building as long as they're in good shape to begin with. And the technique that we use is not going to render them Rackham or friable, if you will. So there are places around the country where flooring and roofing stays in place. Okay, so it's not necessarily required that we always have to remove it, but it has everything to do with whether they'll create Rackham. And there's a guidance document, Guidance to Normal Demolition Practices, that the EPA put out years ago, that specifically explains how things can become Rackham during demolition activity. Like if you had floor tile that you left on a slab, you can't put a half-track vehicle over it. And they give you examples of that nature. So depending on the state, you may be able to do demolition renovation with leaving what we call category 1 materials in place, the flooring and the roofing. The category 2 materials like asbestos, cement, transite, like we have on walls and roofing, that stuff's going to get crumbled. That stuff has to come down in sheets, and it's basically a big disassembly project more than anything. But it depends on the state on this one. The biggest issue that they deal with when people do leave it in a building is they don't clean up the site. And what they find are pieces of flooring and roofing materials all over that demolition site. So what I would tell any demolition contractor, and I have for years, is if you are in a place that you could leave good condition flooring and roofing in place, make sure that you police that area, because the EPA is now using a thing called uncontained asbestos containing waste material, which means you left it behind. And there's been many violations written on that. I've been involved in EPA actions on that on a number of occasions. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. What about the disposal?
Disposal? It could go to a C&D landfill, according to the EPA. But the thing is, I would say that's probably what some people do. Some people might do the demolition and then take it off to an asbestos landfill for good purposes. So it just depends on how the state regulates it in that way. But as an example, say you're pulling up transite pipes underground, okay? Old water lines, they're taking them up out of the ground right now. If you do not create a friable circumstance, or what we call Rackham, according to the EPA, that can go to a C&D, construction demolition landfill. But here's the deal. Most C&D landfills, if they have any clue that it's asbestos, they don't want it. So that's why a lot of times this waste stream ends up going to an asbestos waste, because a lot of those C&D landfills recycle materials, and they have gotten into trouble recycling these asbestos cements and other things in the past.
Interesting. Cliff, do you have anything you wanted to add or any questions? I got a couple more here.
No, go ahead, Joe.
All right. I've been following recently your LinkedIn page. I just want to make sure we mention this page. And I forget the name of it, but you've put up some really good examples of unusual asbestos or little known asbestos uses. I know recently there was one on asbestos wood, which I found interesting, and then another one on asbestos in wiring, etc. Can you first tell our listeners a little bit about that page, and then maybe show us a little bit more of some of these more unusual uses?
Let's see. Can you see the page?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, folks, this is a web page specifically on LinkedIn, specifically for the practitioners that work with asbestos, inspectors, the removal contractors, regulators, people that are interested in managing and dealing with asbestos. This is not a legal page, for litigation. We don't deal with victim stuff here. And what this does is we've got, if you look up here, it's almost 17,000 members. I've had people tell me it's the largest web page of its kind in the world. I've never taken a look to know, but that's what I've been told. And if you go down through here, you're going to see where people post things about different kinds of materials. We do things on regulatory issues, historical things, the Human Torch and the Asbestos Lady. It's a comic book from, I think, DC Comics, I believe.
I never saw that one. That's a good one.
Yeah. There's a whole series of them, actually. And then here's we got a lot of people from Europe as well. And what this is a picture of a mailbox, what they call letterbox. And there's asbestos transite around the letterbox. England is just kind of getting up to speed with all this. This is a young man that was learning how to deal with boilers over in Australia. I post many different historical articles that really aren't in print. That's a great advantage to folks. Let me go down to a couple things. Here's one that's really odd that I thought you might want to see. You guys remember a term for early plastic products called Bakelite?
Yeah.
Ever heard that term? Well, the old
Sure.
Bakelite was loaded with asbestos.
Oh.
So it's a very odd thing. And there's different names for it. Asbestos emity. There's a number of different things, but this is just an example of that. I'll go down here. This is a third world country doing asbestos repairs where they sand down asbestos and then put a sealer on it, which that was posted to show people what not to do. What I wanted to do is I show you this, and I will send this to you so you can put it in your blog. What this is a document we came up with years ago, and it's all the different kind of things that are common that we could find in buildings, and it's 5 pages of materials. And every time I've posted this, and I've posted it a number of times, people jump all over it because they don't get these kind of things in their inspector classes or something. But it's a really helpful thing to really help people understand the varieties of things that are out there. Questions about demolitions and renovations, governmental standards. I'm trying to get down to where the wiring is. Underground pipes. Here's one that's interesting. Dan Peters is one of our more famous guys in the industry. He has a page on Facebook. But these are Fabergé. They look like dandelions, but it's asbestos and gold dots. Yeah, Fabergé days.
You mentioned the UK, and that leads me to a question I have from our conversation earlier in the week. In general, I get the impression from you and others that in the United States, at least, asbestosis is pretty rare nowadays. Lung cancer, it's kind of hard to tell where that came from, but mesothelioma, which is more asbestos specific, seems to be going down, but that is not the case in other parts of the world. Can you expand on that a little for us?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, in the United States, when you take a look at a graph of the amount of disease that's found in different countries, we're actually on the low end of it. Asbestosis is dropping off precipitously, and it should. The types of exposures that cause asbestosis have become very rare today because of regulations and uses of respirators. So as we lose our World War II group, which we've lost most of, and our Vietnam veteran, what I mean by that is age group of people that were exposed in those days, we're seeing scarring go down. As a matter of fact, there's more mesothelioma today than there is asbestosis. With mesothelioma, it is starting to go down a little bit here, but over in the United Kingdom and other countries in Europe, it's continuing to increase. The difference is the type of materials, and we've been in it longer in terms of regulating. In England, what they have is they don't use gypsum board. They have a particle board that they use, quite frankly. I don't remember the name that they use for it, but it's got amosite in it. So every time a workman would drill into this stuff, they would get exposed to this amphibole asbestos, which is bad for cancer risk. And in the UK, because they know this now and they're tracking this and they're trying to get on top of all this, as I told you the other day, the professional workman's tools now, like saws and drills and things, actually have snoots on them to attach a HEPA vacuum, so that when they're actually cutting into this material, they're sucking it up into a HEPA vacuum and not exposing themselves. So yes, in other countries, we're seeing much higher levels of disease than we do here. And it has an awful lot to do with the amphiboles that are more present in those countries than what we find here.
All right. Thank you for Tramex, one of our newest sponsors, helping us with the roundup as well here. Let me go. Cliff, do you have any follow-ups or any last questions?
No, Joe, I'm good. Thanks.
All right. I want to ask a little bit about the future of asbestos and lead and what new things you may see coming down the road, or whether or not you see this as obviously earlier we talked about the fact there's still a lot of it out there. Is it a trend toward more big companies doing this as opposed to smaller companies? Maybe you could tell us a little bit about, rub off your crystal ball. Tell us what you see in the future of asbestos and lead.
Well, there'll be like I said, they'll be working this for years. There's, the number of homes with lead paint in them is astronomical. So this isn't going away. I can only hope as these companies become more commoditized and we get all these companies squished together, that they still value doing work like lead-based paint work, because it's underserved. We have a shortage of lead inspectors and risk assessors in this country. As a matter of fact, with the asbestos work, again, we don't have asbestos removal contractors in every city either. So I can only hope that they continue to do this. We have regulations that are in place for asbestos. We don't need any new regulations. As a matter of fact, I think with lead, we're kind of set as well between what we have with OSHA, EPA, and the HUD guidelines. It has everything to do with enforcement, my friend. And it has everything to do with states picking this up, because the EPA has kind of seen in the long run that, especially when it comes to asbestos, that most of the states, and it's at least 35 designated states, really are taking the forefront on this, and they've dropped back quite a bit on this. So I hope the states stay involved, and they will. But as turnover occurs in these state programs, and as funding levels change in state programs, that they continue to actually do this. If they're designated EPA programs, they have to. But we can only hope that the EPA follows up on it as well. But it has to do with enforcement, and it has to do with people understanding the liabilities that are involved. So the risk managers for the property owners are really the key here, and that they have to realize that they have to do something with asbestos. They just can't allow their workers or their vendors to become exposed. And when it comes to lead, I want everybody to remember, most of the lead work that we deal with is federally funded work, like HUD funded and things like that. So it tends to be houses that are partially fed or entirely, like public housing, federally funded. So as long as we have hazards there will continue to be work there. And there is massive enforcement on this, and there's enforcement in on the lead rules all the time. And with asbestos, especially when it comes to states that have good programs, they hammer people pretty regularly. So enforcement is everything, and keeping the rules in place that we have.
Now, you mentioned enforcement is a big thing. What about legal liabilities? Are there, like a restoration contractor goes in, they cut flood cuts, take out the bottom 2 feet of drywall. It goes over the amount that's allowable through the RRP, which maybe you could mention for our audience. Any lawsuits coming as a result of that? You contaminated my whole house with lead or with asbestos. How do you see it on the legal front?
Well, no, on the long run, there have been massive lawsuits that have already occurred. As part of one of those gigantic vendors that got nailed in RRP, there were a number of children that were lead poisoned because of the work. And there's litigation that's already been involved with that, just in RRP alone. We've had RRP contractors, good people, that have been called in to clean after an internal demolition occurred where somebody wasn't paying attention to lead and they contaminated the whole house. I can assure you the contractor that contaminated that whole house has got a tab to pay, if not a legal fee. The one thing I'm concerned about with asbestos, because we don't have any immediate health effects and we can't measure it like we do with blood levels for lead, is that too many contractors, because of this latency period between when we're exposed to a disease occurs, we tend to undervalue it. So maybe down the road, we'll actually see kids that were working for you today that 30 years from now might have mesothelioma or some other asbestos disease. And there would be a liability if there was no trail about training, medical monitoring, use of respirators, and regulated methods. So I think the restoration contractors have to think about that. But I think this really falls back on the building owners and their risk managers, is to make sure that in these bigger properties that they're making sure that this occurs properly, that not only protect their workers that are doing the maintenance, but the people in these buildings and their vendors as well.
I just want to note there's a comment that a source of lead that is under the radar is from hunted meat, and we'll include that link in the blog, Cliff, if that's okay with you. Before we go, Tom, we always like to give our guest the last word. Anything we missed that you'd like to add? I know I had about 5 or 6 more questions here I wanted to ask you, but we're running low on time.
Number one, folks, read your regulations. That's the biggest problem. People never read regulations. When they go to classes and they see PowerPoints, they think they know all they need to know. That's not the case. If you're the person representing a building owner, a client of any type, and you are in a litigation situation or an enforcement situation, and you say, I didn't know that, it's not going to go well. The biggest problem we have today with kids is going through the phones and trying to figure out something on a phone. We have to actually open regulations and read them. You can't just go by PowerPoints, folks. And that's one of our biggest problems today, is getting people to read and understand things at an expert level when they promote themselves as experts.
Well said, Tom Laubenthal. Thanks for joining us. My thanks to you, my co-host, the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick. John, you got to have faith at the controls. Most importantly, our sponsors and our loyal audience. By the way, next week, we've got Josh Miller, the president of Rainbow Restoration. You're going to want to check that one out. This is from the bottom up kind of guy. He started at the bottom, worked his way up. He's now the president of Rainbow. So looking forward to a great show next Friday at noon when the next episode of IAQ Radio Plus.
For IAQ Radio, I'm Spike Reel saying thanks for listening.